Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof. Today we're going back in time to 2019 when I went one-on-one with author S. Joshua Swamidass to discuss his book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve, The Surprising Science of Universal Ancestry. His book makes the case that the universal genealogical ancestry resolves the perceived conflict between creationists and evolutionists. UGA, writes Swamidass, allows for both God's direct creation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden around 10,000 years ago, and the theory of common descent, which posits humans evolved from lower animals over 1 billion years ago. But before we dive in, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And remember, if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org. Why don't you just introduce maybe just a real thumbnail sketch of the theory, just what you're trying to accomplish with it, and so let people know kind of that basic thesis of your book and where you're at with that.
Yeah, so there's a lot in my book, but the basic idea is Scripture doesn't really talk about genetic ancestry, meaning DNA, because we didn't really know about that a long time ago in the past. But it does talk a lot about genealogical ancestry. It turns out when you come to science with questions about genealogical ancestry, we find out that genealogical ancestors really arise recently, and many things that we thought were in conflict for a very long time between the story of origins from evolution and the story of origins from even a very literal reading of Genesis just really aren't in conflict. I find out that as recently as 6,000 years ago, Adam and Eve could have been de novo created without parents suddenly by a direct act of God in a divinely created garden. And as they were expelled from the garden, they became ancestors of everyone as their offspring interbred with the people outside the garden. Okay. So that's a surprising thing. One of the big objections I initially got was that just sounds like young Earth creationists, and we know that's creationism, and that's false. And in a way, they're right. I mean, it does sound like young Earth creationism, but it turns out that reading is not necessarily in conflict with the evidence if you fill in the details in a way that makes sense.
Well, that's a good intro. Fair enough. Let me start with this. In chapter 7, I just have a little quote from you, and it's going to set up maybe a few questions that I wanted to ask. And it kind of just is, I think, the crux of what most people that would listen to this show would be interested in, the sort of the theology and science. Where do they come together? So you explore, in chapter 7, you explore the different concepts of direct miraculous creation and evolution, and how those kind of may possibly come together. And you write, paradoxically, Adam and Eve could have been created from the dust and a rib without parents, and at the same time we could also share common ancestry with the great apes. These two facts are not in conflict. There is no evidence against the de novo creation of Adam. Our genomes would appear as if they were shared ancestry with the great apes because we do. So I think that is a good sort of a little detailed or technical summary of kind of what you were saying before about the book, how you believe the idea of the theological concept of creation of Adam and Eve, uniquely by God, who weren't, evolved in any way, could interbreed essentially with evolved hominids who were outside the garden. Why don't you tell people, what's the theological importance of the argument you're making here? Why do you think it matters, the theological side? Just on that side of it real quick.
So why does it matter on the theological side? Well, I think the reason why it matters is that a lot of people in the church over the last 160 years have really felt that this is important for several different reasons. So if you go back to 160 years ago when The Origin of the Species was published, it was generally thought, maybe entirely thought, that if evolution was true and applied to humans, then the Genesis account of how most people through history have read it as God creating Adam and Eve from the dust and a rib had to be false. We just know now that sense of that certainty of conflict is false. I would say I think I'm the first scientist to really have demonstrated that to be the case. Now, in terms of more recent people who have thought this is important, we can talk about Ken Keithley, who's a Baptist out in North Carolina, who has written about how he can come to terms with the idea of being out of the dust as being a metaphorical statement of Adam being formed out of some sort of process of common descent. But the story of how Eve is created out of his rib, it's very hard to really accept that as anything other than de novo creation without really threatening his understanding of inerrancy. Tim Keller as well has really stated this. The Gospel Coalition has stated this as really one of the foundational beliefs that they really believe. These are really large groups, not fringe people, not people who are just committed to just taking the Bible and ignoring all science. They really want to engage with science, but they've been told, really for 160 years that there's no way to make their beliefs consistent with the evidence. And that was just not true.
So in your mind, then, what you're saying is that the way you framed your theory, it allows people to hold on to a historic Adam and Eve, yet accept the Darwinian concept of universal common descent.
Well, I wouldn't say Darwinian. I would just say modern evolutionary science.
Well, Darwin had the idea of universal common descent. So, I mean, whether obviously the science is advanced. I mean, he had no concept of genetics, but it didn't originate. But I mean,
so actually,
popularized that idea.
This is an important point. So Darwin did not actually propose that humans shared common ancestry with the great apes. That was actually Thomas Huxley who wrote that first in a book called The Descent of Man. Now, when Darwin actually first published Origin of the Species, he left out human evolution entirely.
Yeah.
Of course, go ahead.
Yeah, I was saying, he doesn't really get into a lot of details, although the headline was sort of there, but he didn't really fill in the details, yeah.
Well, I mean, the headline, it was what I'd say, it was immediately after his book was published, there started to be big debates about human evolution, and that's actually how Huxley got his nickname, like Darwin's Bulldog.
Yeah.
But I think that history is important because, I think Darwin was a great scientist. He had a huge impact on the conversation, but modern science, for good reason, has really kind of moved on from the merely Darwinian point of view. But now you got me off topic.
No, I agree. Yeah, I don't want to get too far. But it's still the idea of universal common descent is what you're saying is reconcilable with historic Adam and Eve, right?
Well, yeah, but I would say that there's even debate among scientists about universal common descent, and if we discovered life on other planets, that would disprove universal common descent. And scientists are certainly looking for life on other planets. I think the key question here is it really reconciles the common descent of man.
Yeah.
With Scripture.
Okay.
So that's, I think, the core thing. Universal common descent is a separate issue.
Let me ask you this then. So, because you talked about you have your theory, and the subtitle is the surprising science of universal ancestry, and I know you do with a lot of this population genetics and the theory of how that goes up, and how essentially Adam and Eve could have been created by God as recently as say 10,000 years ago. Then they would have interbred with the creatures, beings that we haven't gotten to saying what they are yet, so I don't want to put words there just yet. But they would interbred there, and then so they would be by genealogy, like we do on the Ancestry.com kind of thing, like who's my great 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 grandfather, that sort of thing. So you're saying that by interbreeding, they become genealogical ancestors, but not genetic ancestors for all humanity. So I guess that leads to this question, because this has come up in a couple forums, so I thought I'd ask it here. So the way you frame the genealogical ancestry, is your argument, do you think, shielded from scientific scrutiny? In other words, can your theory be falsified by sort of empirical examination?
It depends precisely what you mean. So some parts of what's being put forward, science doesn't really tell us one way or another. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, because science doesn't have the tools to really give us a comprehensive picture of the past, we can't really tell from science. And actually, the vast majority of historical facts in our past, the vast overwhelming majority of them fall into that category. Yeah. And so that's not a reason to discount something. But there's also several claims that I make that are very well justified by evidence, by positive evidence. So one of them is the estimate I give for when genealogical universal ancestors arise. It's built off of several points of evidence. One of them is ancient DNA. Another one is really carefully designed scientific simulations. Other ones are really carefully constructed mathematical approximations. So these are sorts of evidence that could go one way or another, and they could be refined in the future. Now, I gave a very conservative estimate. A more accurate estimate might make it even more likely, or could push it back. Those are the sorts of things that I think there will be inquiry on in the future. And so, that's just how science works. We take evidence we have and we'll put it together in that sort of way. So I don't think there's any sort of weakness there. I think there's some confusion on certain people's part about how science works. That does seem.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true to a large part. I mean, historical science is a much different thing than chemistry that we're doing currently, and we can observe it, we can repeat it in a lab. None of what we're talking about is demonstrable and repeatable in a laboratory context. I mean, on a small level it is, but I mean, we're not gonna go back and we can't observe directly billions of years. We have to infer based on current observations what might have happened historically. So I think that's part of what you're saying is that there are limits.
I would actually back off and say actually all of science that works away, even what we would say is operational science of things like that, most of the time we're looking at evidence in the past, even if it was just a few days in the past or a few months in the past. And my scientific work, I'm looking at large databases of experiments that other scientists have run that's still working in the past. I mean, in the end, you collect data, and then you then look at that data, which is now in the past, and you analyze it. So I don't know if I would make as strong of a statement there. I would just say that it turns out that science is a very powerful way to look at the world, but it's also very limited. It doesn't give us comprehensive views of things.
Yeah. And that's what you're trying to accomplish here is more of a holistic view, integrating philosophy and history and theology and science. So, and that's why I asked that question. I mean, I think it's fair that some parts couldn't be falsified, but neither could a lot of theology or philosophy scientifically falsified because they go beyond it. And so there's an underlying assumption in that question, which I agree, and I think that's what you pointed out.
Well, I would say it's not even just that. I would say things in the physical world that we all share.
Yeah.
Most of the things that happen in the physical world we all share, we cannot reconstruct scientifically. They're just outside the view. Yeah. And so that's just the way it is.
Yeah. Science has its limits, and we can't. And your theory doesn't fall on the fact that science has limits. So I think that's kind of what I think is the upshot of that is that there are parts of it that we could argue about. Okay, scientists are not the science of it. But when it gets to the other parts of the theory, it's not meant to be a scientific theory in that sense. It's a broader philosophical, theological theory as well. So, those parts obviously, like any philosophy or theology, wouldn't be subject to science. They'd have to use laws of logic or other such things to sort of discount them.
Yeah, I mean, I like actually how Andy Crouch puts it in his endorsement. He says that is really bringing us to the grand question of how sacred and natural history might fit together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so we are looking at history. I mean, and I think, one of the core points I make in the book is that Scripture really speaks through a periscope on our past, and so does science. It's like a periscope, like in a submarine, you can see things, but depending on where you're pointed, there's massive peripheral vision, where there's things happening there, and we just can't see out into those corners. And so the thesis is that, there's really nothing to tell us that Scripture and science aren't two different periscopes on the same physical reality in this world. Mm-hmm. And that Adam and Eve could be real just as literally been understood for the vast majority of church history. And also evolution could be true in the same way it's been understood by the vast majority of scientists. It's some providentially governed process of common descent. Yeah. They're just not in conflict. I mean, you can still think that one of them is false, but we have to agree, I think, that they're not in conflict anymore.
Yeah, and that's if your theory is taken and evaluated as valid, it would that's what it purports to accomplish. I wouldn't be as strong as say it definitely shows that, but I think that's the case you're trying to make, and we'll see how it goes with the response and as people critique it. But that's the goal. So let me do this one thing. So if I read your argument right, you are convinced that science does exclude at least the possibility of an historical Adam and Eve as the biological progenitors of all humans. So,
well, no, I wouldn't say biological. I think there's a difference between biological and genetic, right? So they would be biological ancestors of everyone.
Okay.
And genealogy is a type of biology, right? It's like procreation. So I do think they are our biological ancestors. I don't think that they would be our genetic ancestors. So that's a different thing.
Okay. So they wouldn't be, okay, so let's put it this way, because most theological statements say that Adam and Eve would be the parents of all humanity.
And that's what I affirm directly in the book.
Okay, so you believe then that based on that distinction between biological and genetic, that those are reconcilable, right?
Yeah, what I would say is that scripture and traditional theology don't talk about DNA.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And genetic means DNA. It just means DNA. And so they're not talking about genetic ancestry. They do have genealogies. They're talking about parent-child relationships. That is a type of biology. I don't mean that in a cordis sense. It's just an ordinary understanding of reproduction. And so because they are talking about genealogy, yeah. I mean, I'd say that our best understanding of science is that if Adam and Eve exist, then they are the ancestors of everyone, at least by 2000 AD, when the time that Jesus walks the earth.
Okay. So maybe just put a little emphasis, make that distinction that you're trying to make between biological and genetic, and maybe give an illustration of how that would be different, why that distinction is important in making your case.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So, because we tend to think that genetic ancestry is the same thing as genealogical in our moment. There's a whole host of sociological reasons why, but it turns out that's just not true. So one way to think about that is to think about just your own chain of ancestry. So I'm a person just like you. I have a genome, and I have two parents, like everyone listening to this, or most people at least. And I got 50% of my DNA from my mother and 50% from my father, even though both of them are 100% my genealogical ancestors, only 50% my genetic ancestors. If I go back one more generation, my grandparents each gave me 25% of my genome, even though they're 100% my genealogical ancestors. I go back another generation, it's 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, until very quickly, just within about 15 or so generations, 10 to 15 generations, the majority of my genealogical ancestors don't pass me any DNA. That's the surprising thing. But they are entirely my genealogical ancestors. They just don't give me any DNA. And then the question becomes, what does actually Scripture care about? What does theology care about? At times the word genetic appears, but that's not what they mean. They don't mean DNA in theology.
Yeah.
They mean ancestors. So what I'm saying is that if we actually had the ability to construct out the true history of our parentage going back thousands of years, of course we can't do that, but if we could, we would find that Adam and Eve, if they exist, appear in everyone's pedigree or everyone's genealogical relationships. And that is what it appears to be the strongest statement you can make from Scripture about our ancestry and Adam and Eve. And not everyone agrees with this. There are certainly theologians who disagree. Some think that Adam and Eve don't even exist. They think that Adam and Eve are a myth, and that's fine. Certainly my atheist colleagues that endorse the book think that Adam and Eve are a myth. That's fine too. But the point is that if Adam and Eve did exist, then we think that we all descend from them. And we don't have to make allowances for the idea that we don't, because actually this core doctrine of monogenesis through church history, certainly over the last 500 years, turns out actually to be true. If Adam and Eve exist, we all descend from them.
Okay. So that's a nice, clear explanation. It makes sense, sort of makes clear that distinction you're trying to make and how that's important. So what? This is sort of like on the lines of still some of the sciencey things I wanted to kind of get at. So what sort of scientific value do you think your theory of genealogical Adam and Eve or ancestry has for us? In other words, is there a predictive quality to your theory? Does it generate other scientific inquiry that we could go into? Is there something that, okay, now I'm done with this, the next project is in science is this?
So you're kind of, I'm not sure where you're getting those critiques from, but those generally come from people that have more of a positivist view. They think that the only things that are true in the world that are worth talking about are the ones that we can demonstrate scientifically.
Sure. Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to ask. I'm just trying to say, is there something though? Whether somebody discounts that or not, that's how they're going to interpret that. But I am just curious to know: does this theory generate further inquiry into other scientific theories that you see taking place or not?
Oh yeah, so I think that there are some really interesting questions that come up. Like one place where I think a lot of questions arose that had some really interesting science behind it was what's going on in Tasmania, and what the evidence might tip us whether or not we can actually really show there was mixing or not there. And I think that's one place where I'd really like to see more work done on ancient DNA and on the fossil evidence there.
So you think
that's an example, but there's actually several others too. So yeah,
sure.
A lot of scientists already care about these things, and we're right in the middle of something called the ancient DNA revolution. It's led by a few really key groups. One of them I quote extensively in the book, David Reich, who wrote a really good book called Who We Are and Who We Came From. And he just got a large grant to study ancient genomes in the Middle East, actually.
Yeah.
And I think that what's going on is we're just getting an unprecedented view of human history over the last 10 to 20,000 years in a way we've just never had it before. We're seeing some events that we've already have recorded history from. We see now a genetic record of that. Things like the slave trade, we can see a genetic record of that. But then we're also seeing all these events that we had no idea about because they weren't recorded in history. And so that's this amazing story that's unfolding that scientists really are curious about. They're publishing on it. But there's an opportunity now for a larger community of people, including theologians and historians, to engage that story as well. And I guess one of my hopes with this book is that it might invite some theologians to engage that story as well.
Yeah. No, that's good. I think that's one of the keys here. Your argument on page 136, 137, you talk about textual definition of human relies a lot, and that relies on a lot of Hebrew and Greek. And I'm assuming that's not your background languages, right? I mean, because you're a scientist by background, right? So you didn't study Greek and Hebrew, those sorts of things, correct?
So I did not study Greek and Hebrew, but I did work closely with several exegetes.
So I understand. That's fine. But that's important. That's all I wanted to say. That is, I think what we need to get better at across the board is working interdisciplinary studies.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And not bashing people who are coming outside of their discipline to speak. Because I think academia is a little bit too focused on, okay, you have to be the expert on this such a minuscule thing. Nobody reads outside or does anything outside of their discipline. And that's created a lot of problems, I think, in our research and in our studies. So, and I don't point that out that your argument depends on that. And you can see you consulted. I know you brought a lot of good scholars and people to your school, and you had some good funding from Templeton to bring in and talk to a lot of people. But I just wanted to bring out that isn't your background, but that's okay too. That doesn't automatically discount what somebody's doing. And I think that's important. They can allow for room for critique, but it doesn't dismiss it out of hand, I think is important.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think actually one of the big themes of the book is precisely your point. It starts with a fracture and it moves to talking about a crossroads. An interdisciplinary exchange between the worlds is what I call it. And that's really what the goal and the purpose of the book is.
Yeah.
One of the things that really bothers me a great deal actually about how the conversation has been proceeding is that legitimate questions by people outside science were largely ignored and dismissed by people in science for a very long time, and from people who you would think should be sympathetic.
Yeah.
And I think that, they were often, kind of kicked back into the corner saying, well, you shouldn't comment on this because you're a scientist. And that kind of leaves them with a situation where they either have to choose to just capitulate to science at surface level or to just take an adversarial relationship with it. And I don't think either approach is very good. I think one thing I really tried to do here in this book is to take questions seriously. And to receive them with curiosity, courage, and empathy. And I think that just needs to happen more.
Yeah. Well, it's like, I think we mentioned Thomas Kuhn in the pre-show when we were chatting. Your theory is very Kuhnian in the sense of it's disruptive. It's trying to make a change. And people will evaluate it. We'll dig into the book. The book just came out. But that argument, that discussion shouldn't cause fear amongst anybody, whether they're scientists or Christians. Along that line, what do you think of, I'm sure you're familiar with David Glertner. He's a professor of computer science at Yale. And actually, I thought about this quote when I was looking at your book. He says this: "There's no reason to doubt that Darwin explained the small adjustments by which an organism adapts to local circumstances, changes to fur density or wing style or beak shape. Yet there are many reasons to doubt whether he can answer the hard questions and explain the big picture, not the fine-tuning of existing species, but the emergence of new ones. The origin of the species is exactly what Darwin cannot explain." So Glertner, he's coming outside of his discipline. Obviously, he's a computer guy, although he's, by all accounts, some sort of a polymath. He's into art and science. He's one of the sort of Renaissance guys, I guess would be the old way of saying it. But he's been a an evolutionist guy his whole life, and then he's recently sort of saying, I'm coming away from this. Do you think there's a place in your debate to even still critique evolution, or is it so in your mind rock solid that humans evolved from lower forms that we can't even question that anymore?
I'm comfortable with whatever you want to believe about it. I'm not really here to change your mind.
Sure.
What I can tell you is that, I was raised a young Earth creationist. I was an old Earth creationist for a while. I was really convinced by a lot of the arguments, but then what really changed things is actually seeing the evidence for myself.
Sure.
And I found out that actually the way how evolutionary science had been represented to me in the church by a lot of these other groups, it just wasn't accurate to actually how scientists really believed it.
Yeah.
And so, all I can say is that the evidence for common descent is extremely strong, and it's largely unengaged by Christian opponents of evolution. And a lot of the loopholes that were there have really been solidly closed over the last 20 years in the age of genomes. And I don't have an agenda here. If you want to reject evolution, I'm fine with that. I do want to also add too that none of this means that God wasn't involved and didn't do it. Maybe God did.
Sure. No, and that's actually the good question. Actually, that's why I was going here. I want to lead into this sort of part of it, the theological side more than just the sciencey side. So Adam and Eve, in your idea, could be created. And you're still, are you, by the way, are you agnostic on that? Or, do you believe Adam and Eve were, created de novo by God, or just,
Christian,
you just allow for that?
The part in my book, I actually don't explain my view, which is...
Yeah, I know. That's why I was just curious. I just don't want to put words in your mouth when I'm asking my question
I appreciate that sensitivity. So, because the purpose of my book is I'm really just trying to create space for differences. Now, personally, I'm a Christian that places my cornerstone on Jesus rather than Adam. I know there's other types of Christians out there, but I find my cornerstone in Jesus, and I believe he rose from the dead. That's why I follow him, not because of anything with Adam and Eve. So that gives me some freedom when I think about Adam and Eve. Now, when I look at church history, it really does seem part of infallibility seems to be a lot of people in the church really do think the historical reality about Adam and Eve is important. So I'm inclined to agree with that too. I don't see anything in science that challenges it either. So I would say that. Now, in terms of the precise details, I just see so many ways that it could work out. I don't know actually how I could be anything other than an agnostic. So
okay. No, that's fine. And that's fair. I just didn't want to put words in your mouth when I asked the question, say you were agnostic towards it, or you were definitive, or you didn't care. It's not that you don't care. I wanted to frame that sort of in a way that accurately reflects that. But so were the hominids that Adam and Eve were interbreeding with after they were created by God, were they fully human in your view? So both Adam and Eve and the hominids are... Well,
so if you go with a recent Adam and Eve, like we're talking here, so I'm writing a book right now with William Lane Craig, we're talking an ancient Adam and Eve, so that might be different. That's a different conversation, though. But if we're talking about a recent Adam and Eve, the people outside were fully a human in really critical ways. They had a full theory of mind, they were fully biologically human, they were genetically indistinguishable. If you met them, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between them.
So they were fully, in your mind, the people outside were people. They were human people outside, fully human, consciousness, personhood, all those sort of, whatever, all those qualifiers that people might have, which differ, obviously. But they had
in this scenario,
soul of some kind, or, were they soulish humans, or do you put a place for soul in your view of humanhood, how you see that?
Well, so there's several different views of the soul.
Yes.
I think ultimately ends up being something pretty close to consciousness. So they were sentient, so they had souls. But it becomes a question of were they the exact same type of souls as ours? So I think the language that might be helpful is that they were fully human, but they were a different. Not from a scientific point of view. From a scientific point of view, they're indistinguishable. But from a theological point of view, there's something different about them.
Okay, so I guess that's sort of this merging of science theology, part of where your theory comes at. So is there, in your view, anything about those humans outside the garden that science couldn't explain? In other words, did God intervene in that process as because I know you used to be with biologos and sort of the theistic evolution. I know you don't like that term anymore, so I don't know where that comes in here, but is God intervening along that process of evolution in your view, or does that not matter? Or could evolution, in other words, fully explain just biological processes, I should say.
Well,
Could
so
that fully explain their humanness, or did God need to intervene in that?
I just say we're touching on a grand mystery that even scientists themselves don't know exactly how humans arose in that fullness. I mean, it's never happened before. We can't replicate it in a lab.
Yeah.
It's a grand mystery. So, I don't think that there's like clear evidence that you can point to demonstrate this in DNA. Even Michael Behe agrees with this. He'll point to bacterial evolution as evidence of design, but when he looks at humans, he says that there's really just no biochemical evidence for God's design there, which is remarkable. However, he will point to the amazingness of the human mind, and it is a puzzle. So I would say that I would agree with Behe on human evolution that the evidence is very strong for common descent. There's no strong evidence that God intervened, but at the same time, I would also say there's strong evidence that if God intervened, that we wouldn't be able to detect it. So there's no reason to doubt that. This is one of those other things that's kind of outside the streetlight. There's certain things that science can tell us. This is one of those things that's outside of the ability to tell us. And so what I would really dispute is the people who come in very hot and heavy on either side, claiming strong evidence for or against God's action here. I just don't think we have it.
Okay. So in your view, consciousness, human consciousness, that could be an emergent quality, purely based, purely emergent within biological systems, or it could have somehow been, God could have intervened at some point and in the biological process and ensouled those people or something. So those are two different distinct theories.
As a scientist, that's a question that's really beyond science. Now, speaking as a Christian, I think there's very good reason to think that God was providentially governing evolution, and that he was doing that. Now, that's not speaking as a scientist. It's speaking as a Christian. And I would not be surprised if that was the case. I mean, and what I do know, though, is that God providentially governs all things, including evolution, if it's true. Okay. And there's really no theological challenge there. And in fact, he can also directly intervene and do things. It's just that he doesn't really tell us, and it's very hard for us from our human point of view to understand how he providentially governs and how he intervenes unless he sits down and tells us. Now, the one place when it comes to origins where it does seem pretty clear that he sat down and told us to a lot of people, which I think we need to grapple with, is the special creation of Adam and Eve. Now, I do think that there is wiggle room in Scripture. I don't think that Christians that don't affirm that are unfaithful. I already said I'm kind of an agnostic on it too.
Sure.
There's been a large number of Christians throughout history, including now, that really believe that that's what Scripture teaches. And I think that for a long time we thought they were in conflict with evidence, and they're just not. And so I think we have to do a little bit of backing up over the last 160 years and kind of rehab that conversation to figure out how really important this is and figure out what we should really believe in, because we thought it was in conflict with the evidence, but it's just not.
Okay. So that sort of changes a little bit what my next question was, and I'll rephrase it as a question. Hopefully this gets a good sense of where you're at then. So it's not so much that your argument is trying to say that that we need to say that there was a historical Adam and Eve. You're just trying to say that there's a tent big enough to allow for the theology of a historic Adam and Eve given the framework of what we know from science. Is that fair? Is that a fair sort of summary?
Basically, we thought that science, or evolutionary science, demonstrated the traditional reading of Genesis is wrong, but we were wrong. It turns out that a traditional de novo understanding of Adam and Eve, even with them recently created ancestors of Paul in the recent past, is entirely consistent with the evidence. That is a fact. That is, I would say, nearly undisputed right now among scientists, including non-Christian scientists right now, because of my work. Now, what actually happened is a separate question, and I think there's an opportunity for a larger conversation.
Sure. And you're just trying to make room for that, all those other competing ideas. If I'm getting that right, you're saying science can't exclude the possibility. Now, theologians argue amongst yourself, philosophers, which of those things you want to hold, but you're saying that sort of on the science side, it doesn't exclude that potential for that discussion to even take place. Is that kind of where you're coming from?
Right. I would even add to that, I'm making a moral argument that it's good for society and it's good for the church to make space for that view, to make space for those types of differences.
Well, I would agree with that for sure. Especially, that actually gets to our concept of race. So not to, but let's pull it into that.
Go on in that moral argument. I want to emphasize though. It's not just you as a person who cares about historical Adam who really agrees with it. I'm telling you, there's a lot of Christians that don't agree with the historical Adam and Eve. They agree with that moral argument, and there's even atheist scientists that are agreeing with that moral argument too. So the moral argument is that we can make space for it, but we also should make space for it because it's good for society and it's good for science and it's good for the church.
Yeah. What is it? Even Dawkins, I think, I haven't read real deeply on this because I've been preoccupied, but I think even Dawkins in this last week had an interview with one of these papers that talked about the idea of eliminating Christianity from the public square has been a sort of a disastrous thing. But I think that sort of dovetails with what you're saying is even some of that potentially from at least my limited understanding.
A person like Nathan Lentz, he's an atheist biologist, wrote an article in USA Today about this. And,
I read that last
week. We just did an event in New York that will be publicly online. I mean, I think the fact of the matter is that there are anti-religious atheists out there like Dawkins, and maybe he'll change. That'd be great. But the fact of the matter is that most scientists, even if they're atheists, aren't anti-religious. They're really trying to, once again, serve society. And I think making space for the traditional beliefs of Christians, once again, it's good for society. It's good for science. It's good for the church. So we should do it. Now, I understand some people don't want to, but I think that's part of my argument here. It's a moral argument.
Okay. No, that's good. So we'll stick with the moral side of things because that's where, as an ethicist, I sort of want to hang my hat on a lot of things. Your book does address sort of the history of racism related to certain theories of human origins. How does your theory of genealogical ancestry speak to the problem of scientific racism?
Yeah, so first of all, it's important to remember that race is a very recent idea. It's probably over the last 500 years or so. If you go back, the time of Jesus, for example, they didn't really have the same concept of race that maps onto the way we do. So, and it's also really important to understand that it seemed almost like a common sense thing 500 years ago, with the discovery of the New World and the rise of colonialism. It just seemed obvious that there were different races with different abilities, that God had different stations in life for. That was just obvious. Okay. That's what it seemed like. It just turns out that when you actually look at the actual evidence, it just turns out to be totally false. Race, as we understand it, is really just not a biological phenomenon. It doesn't correlate with biology the way we think. Now, it took a while for us to realize that. Scientists probably only really came to a strong consensus about this within, the last generation, like over the last 50 or 60 years.
Yeah, really, it was in the 1960s that they started to get into race as a social construct kind of theory stuff.
Well, it wasn't that. It was actually, Alan Templeton, who's one of the people who endorsed my books, is the population geneticist who actually has published some really important work on race. A lot of it was first published in the 70s, actually, showing that the notion of genetic race doesn't actually hold up. I mean, we get into the details of that.
Yeah.
There's also some stuff that happened in the 60s with the great ape language experiments where you find out that there really is a very big difference between, the great apes and us. I mean, maybe they are our closest ancestors, but we're really different from them. I list out several different things too. I mean, another thing too is when the colonialists would show up in, the New World or wherever, they kind of see all these natives there, and I'm saying that with quotes because it is a bit derogatory. Didn't have their culture, and they just say, well, obviously they're not as smart as us. But now we have a different experience. We know that we can take people from across the world, even if just a generation ago all of their ancestors were hunter-gatherers. We put them into the exact same environment of all of us, and they end up being indistinguishable from us. We know that now. They didn't know it back then.
Yeah.
So we have all that evidence that it was really there. But the way how conservative theologians really stood up against polygenesis and the racism associated with it was by saying, well, actually, this whole idea that we're so separate is not true. It turns out we believe, because of our understanding of theology and monogenesis, which simply stated is that we all descend from Adam and Eve.
Yeah. Genealogically speaking.
Long time scientists disagreed, and it just turns out that that we were wrong. That actually that historical affirmation of the unity of mankind, that we all descend from Adam and Eve, turns out to be true in the sense that if Adam and Eve exist, we all descend from them. And that's, I think, is monumental as an important shift when it came from scientists about 100 years ago deciding, well, actually, I guess the universe did have a beginning after all. Yeah. I think it's a similar sort of shift that's happened in science.
Yeah. So I'm glad you addressed that in the book, whether somebody agrees with it or not, to recognize that I think one of the positives of what you are offering is that it does safeguard that concept of human sacredness to the point that it doesn't allow room for legitimate arguments of racism. People may still be racist and say, I love Joshua Sonadis, but I'm a racist, which would be weird, but but it wouldn't allow for, they couldn't philosophically come from that from your theory. Well, I told folks we'd be about 45 minutes or a few minutes over, so I want to wrap it up. I know there'll be folks disappointed that I didn't attack you for certain things, and folks thought I attacked you too much. Internet's full of that stuff. But I did really want to just sort of ask you a lot of just sort of general questions that brought in some ideas, and some have been, critical in that sense, but just give you sort of space to answer in your own words. I think that's a lot more fun for people in interviewing than fighting.
Yeah, I would say thanks for having me on the show. This is a really open-ended conversation, so the conversation is really growing. We'd love to have you join it, and anytime you want to pick it up again, I'm looking forward to it.
All right, take care, brother. God bless. There is so much more that we could say about Swami Das's theory, and you can find some links to helpful resources in the show notes. But for now, I'm going to encourage you to go out and till the soil of culture so that you can raise the roof on the blind foxes of theistic evolution and expose your friends and family to the beauty of God's true story of creation. I hope you'll come back and join me for the next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org.